Hi, Nadia. Welcome to Brown Girls Read.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for being here, Nadia, and taking the time to, come and talk to us about your book, Sparks Like Stars. And we also have a lot of other questions for you as well. So I guess we can begin. Taman, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I have read a bunch of your books before. I was really excited to read Sparks Like Stars, but we didn't know that when we would be reading this book, all these things would be happening in the world. And like most of us know, things have drastically changed in Afghanistan since Taliban has taken over control. So, first of all, we wanted to just check in with you like, how's everything going with you? How are you doing with this? And how are you coping with it?
It's truly been a really heartbreaking time. It's been a very busy time, and just stressful in a lot of ways, to be very honest. We have some relatives who are still in Kabul. My husband has relatives still in Kabul. There are people who are very, very worried about what's going to happen. Some of them because of the work that they were doing before all of this happened, and some people that we know have already been threatened by the Taliban. So we're very concerned for them. We were concerned during the evacuation process because there were people who were trying to flee, and the airport had become such a dangerous place. And it was very hard to give anybody advice on what to do or what the best choices were. So it was just very, very difficult, not just for us, but for so many families who were having the same kinds of conversations, receiving the same kinds of desperate messages, and feeling the same kind of helplessness about what we could do. At the same time, I was getting a lot of information to me from people who were in these networks of women activists, of women in leadership, of women who really needed to be evacuated from the country because of the targets on their backs as well. So we have really been trying. There's also been a lot of energy that we've put into creating a safe, warm welcome for the people who are arriving here in the United States. So, energies are just, and attention has been pulled in several different directions, along with, we all also have our own lives and our own families and responsibilities. And so I think everyone is just feeling pulled in many different directions, wanting to do something in this moment, and trying to make the best out of all these different tugging forces.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine doing all of this. And it's it also feels like no matter how much you do, it's just not enough, right?
It really isn't enough because you look at, it's like picking up one pebble and then realizing there's still a mountain in front of you that needs to be moved. So, but I think that I was talking with some friends, and the goal is really to see if those of us who are in this space right now can just focus on these small triumphs and focus on what we have been able to do and the movements that we have been able to create, because otherwise it can be very overwhelming and really disheartening and demoralizing.
Right. And since we're also going to talk about the book a little bit and Sparks Like Stars as well, you touched upon um, this feeling of how immigrants feel when something is happening in their origin country. And it's a very complicated complex feeling because you are living here in the US, but there is something that's happening to your people in a different country, in your country actually. So I'm pretty sure there are people like that, like you, and there are other people who are feeling the same thing. What is one message that you would like to send to them in these times?
I think the solidarity has been the most uplifting, the most empowering, and the most nurturing, right? Because in order to be able to do this and to persist in this space and in this kind of work, it really takes a lot of replenishing. And one of the ways that I have found to keep myself going and to keep my energies up is by being around people who are doing the same, who are of the same heart. And that's not necessarily people, from my own community. I mean, for the most part, it is. But there are also a lot of allies that we have. There are a lot of friends that we have, people who are willing to stand shoulder to shoulder, as they say, and work towards the same goals, and to understand that the experience of refugees at this particular moment, may feel unique, but it really isn't. And so, drawing some connections, for example, between the Afghan refugee community and the Vietnamese refugee community, or what has happened in different periods of the past. And I think that's the kind of thing that that we should be focused on, and we should help one another turn our attentions to the positives that are coming out, because otherwise it gets very dark.
Yeah, that's very true. And um do you have some suggestions of how people like us who are immigrants and who want to help can help refugees? Are there some organizations that we can donate something to, or anything of that sort?
Sure, they are, and that's the outpouring of support, like I said, from the broader community has been truly amazing. There have been donation drives that have set up in different areas, particularly around the areas where these refugees are landing. So what's been happening is that the refugees, or the newly arriveds, are coming through mostly through Dulles Airport, and then also into Philadelphia now. And then they're placed in different military bases around the country. And at those bases is where they initially have needed some supplies. From there, they're going to go into resettlement, and they will find themselves in different communities. And so resettlement agencies are really going to be the ones that are looking for donations for people to help newly arrived Afghans to get to their appointments, because they won't necessarily have cars, they won't have driver's licenses, and so sometimes it's just logistical help. Learning English, so teaching English to newly arriveds, teaching them to drive, helping them get to not just doctor's appointments, but also helping folks get their children registered for school. Like, those are types of things that people can volunteer through resettlement agencies or through other community organizations to help folks who are landing within their neighborhoods.
Thanks. That is so helpful. And yeah, there are, some things that we don't even understand would be needed. And you touched on those things. So thank you for that. And we're definitely going to look for some organizations that we can help with.
And beyond that, honestly, I think that, we will see people in our communities, right? We will see them on the street, we will see them in the grocery store. And sometimes it just means a lot to get a smile. And, even a lot of us have our masks on, but you can still smile through your eyes, right? Your eyes still smile with you. And sometimes that can make a world of difference. So I think there are large and small ways that people can be welcoming.
That's a beautiful message. Thank you so much, Nadia.
Nadia, you have written a lot of books that are rooted in Afghanistan, all the stories of people, how they're living their lives there. And there are a lot more books about Afghanistan, and most of them are written against this backdrop of war. And with some books, I've noticed that they end up stereotyping people as either victims or terrorists, or attach certain identities to religion, especially when these books end up being consumed by the Western world. Like, I remember reading The Kite Runner as a teenager, and I loved the book. The book is really famous. There's a movie made on it. But now, when you kind of go back and look at things, it's like, in some ways, it associated things like pedophilia to Afghan men, also abusive personality to them. So I wonder how writers can be more responsible about creating these images.
Yeah, I think it's a twofold responsibility. I think some of the responsibility is on the writer, and then I think some of the responsibility is also on the reader, right? I mean, if I read a book that is about an American woman, I do not believe that that is meant to tell me the story of every American woman, right? And so on the consumption side of this, we also have a responsibility to acknowledge that every story is one single story, and it is not meant to represent an entire nation's narrative, right? Or an entire population's narrative. But then there's also the responsibility of the writer. And for sure, I think that we as writers, I mean, I can't really speak for writers in general, but I know that I can speak for myself in acknowledging that there are stereotypes and hoping to be able to show people the nuance that is more interesting to me anyway, right? And so if I try to write about a character who is, the quote unquote like villain of the story or the bad guy, I always find it much more interesting to incorporate a bit of humanity into those people as well. The backstory, what is leading them to make these choices that we so want to, disagree with, that we see as evil or negative, or wherever they may fall on the spectrum. Because I think that that's where we really start to understand why people are the way they are. And that's what helps us to make connections, because I cannot relate to a superhero, right? In the same way that I cannot relate to, the Joker or any of these like super villains, because they're beyond the scope of reality, of humanity. But in truth, people fall somewhere closer to us, whether we see them as the protagonist or the antagonist of the story. And there's so much more nuance in our interactions. And so that's the space that I find more interesting and very worthy. But like I said, I cannot speak for all writers. And I will insist that it is a two-way responsibility, that we as readers as well have to think about our lens as we are consuming stories.
I definitely agree with that. Whether it's books or movies, the way we consume them play a role, because I have often felt that movies do that a lot. They'll take a certain kind of a character, and we are Indians, right? So Indians in Western world often are played as like taxi drivers, if at all they are in the movie, right? So it sets a certain stereotype, even though it can be true that a lot of Indians came here, lack of jobs, they had to take up that profession, but still like perpetuating it further and further is where I think there's like the responsibility of the creator of movies as well.
Right. I mean, I think we can lean into things that are definitely truths in our community and in our narratives, without pushing it to the extent that it becomes a caricature, right?
Yeah.
Of like a very exaggerated persona. And that's, and I can tell you that I've had people write to me about books that I have written that they've read, and the same book with the same words and the same writings. I've had one person write to me about The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, and they said, wow, this book really shows how horrible Islam is for women. And then I've had another person write to me and said, I read The Pearl That Broke Its Shell, and you really portrayed the role of our religion so beautifully in uplifting us in times. And so, it just depends on how you're looking at things. The same story can be consumed in very different ways.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah, that's actually definitely true. And on the same lines, I think Daman also touched upon it a little bit in her question. Like in times like these, people start defining the extremists by their religion, right? So, for example, Taliban has a particular religion, and then what usually happens is that the religion starts getting blamed for what people or extremists are doing, and usually because people are unaware and ignorant about other religions. So, and I keep wondering about that, why does that happen? So what are your thoughts on that? Like, what message would you like to send to those people who are just defining, a religion based on some extremists?
No, I think it's sort of the lazy route to take, right? It's if you allow headlines to inform you, then you're not going to be very well informed. And if you allow sound bites or one tweet to inform you, you're not going to be very well informed, because there is no way to boil everything down into that much space. And so it really does take much more digging. You've got to open ourselves to accept that there is a whole body of experiences and a whole body of knowledge and information that's out there. And so if you just take a look at the Taliban and say, that's it, that's my whole education on what it means to be a Muslim, then you've really shortchanged yourself, and you have, failed to understand that how many people in this world are living that faith in a very, very different way. And that's even within Afghanistan, right? We're not talking about, having to travel to another country that's miles and miles away. And the same thing with any other group of people. It doesn't even have to be an ideology that we're looking at. If we take a look at, how do we understand different cultures as well? If you see something that's happening in one culture or in one household, that does not mean that it extrapolates. And so I think we really have to be able to not be so short-sighted and not so easily quenched in our looking for information, that one line that you get is not it. You've got to keep reading, you've got to keep digging, and just be very skeptical. I think everything that we read, we have to take with a grain of salt, because what we're handed is really it's just these distillations that don't really do justice to what we're actually trying to get a taste of.
So coming back to the book a little bit, I really loved how Sitara's story touches on a multitude of things. One is the very obvious one, a child who saw war firsthand and how it affects, whether it's through depression, PTSD, and one nuance that you put in the book, which was that she checks the evacuation maps in the hotels when she goes. And then I don't know if it's a coincidence, I saw a photo on your Instagram where you had posted something like that. And I was like, okay, is this a personal touch or what is it? I'm very curious about that.
Okay, so it's funny you're saying that now, because I did post that on Instagram, and I actually had forgotten that I'd written that in the book. I mean, I wrote the book a while ago now. It only came out this year, but the time that I actually wrote it was well before that, and sometimes I forget what I've written. So I was not making that connection when I thought about it. And the truth is that when I was looking at that I was standing in front of an elevator, right? I'd gone to an appointment and I'm standing in front of the elevator and I'm looking at this evacuation map. And what I've been doing for the past 2 weeks is trying to evacuate people. And so I'm looking at this map and it looks, little quick little red line, go from here to here, walk here, and you're out, right? And it just looked so dismissive to me in a time where I'm like thinking about people who are at an airport who can't get past one of the gates, who are being turned away at Taliban checkpoints, who are being turned away by the US. They're being told that ISIS is in the area and there's threats of a bombing. And yet they know that if they don't get through this airport and take these risks and walk through this canal of sewage, then they may not ever get out. And this is our evacuation plan. So, but it's interesting that history seems to go in very small circles in Afghanistan, and what's happened, then is happening now. When I was growing up, I was helping my parents fill out paperwork and immigration forms for family members. And literally in the last week, at one point, I was so overwhelmed that I had my 10-year-old daughter helping me to transcribe information from one spreadsheet onto another. And so I'm thinking, here she is doing what I was doing when I was a little girl. And, for how many generations are we going to do this? Are we always going to be doing this? Is our next generation then going to have to learn all this terminology and figure out how to, write the right names and the right information in the right boxes, and then pray that somebody will come out to safety? It's been really heartbreaking to see how things come full circle from my past through the story and then into what's happening right now.
Yeah, we can't even imagine, Nadia, like how it must be for you. But even reading the book, it felt like, okay, you wrote about a piece of history that happened, and now what's happening is like there were like so many parallels between those two things that the book was really hard to read because of that.
Yeah, I think maybe that's why I have sort of pushed some of the thinking away around that story, because and this moment is really, it's not about me, it's not about that story, it is about the people who are living this moment right now and will then be carrying the trauma that somebody like Sitara had to carry for the rest of her life. And so we have now another generation of real people, not fictional characters, but very real people, real children, real moms, real dads, who are going to carry this trauma forward with them. And a country that is now having a brutal blow inflicted upon it with, with a regime that I don't know how long it will last. But we do know that will be very, very damaging to the people who still have to live there.
Yeah, and reading about, the effect that war has on children was also very, very hard in this book. And I can't, like, keep seeing these stories of, children in Syria getting affected because of war. And it is just disheartening to see that. Do you like how so I wanted to ask, like, what inspired the character of Sitara? Like, did you always wanted to write about a little girl who was going through war and hardships and how she comes out of it? Was that the reason?
So Satara came from me wanting to talk about this time in history, wanting to talk about Afghanistan before the war, this Afghanistan that I inherited from my parents through the photographs that we had on our walls, through the stories that they would tell me of this peaceful, beautiful place where they had Peace Corps volunteers and just people from other countries. And it had a very different feeling, and was very welcoming to foreigners as well. So I wanted to talk about that period of history. And that took me to, what then happened that changed this? What was the tipping point? And it really, as I dug in, it was really this 1978 military coup that turned inward on the country. And when I was reading the news article about the bodies from that night, from the assassination, they'd been buried in an unmarked grave. And so when I was reading this news article about the discovery of those bodies decades later, there was a description of the bodies that were found and how it included not just the president of Afghanistan at that time, but his wife and several family members, including 4 of his grandchildren. And the youngest was just a toddler. And that stuck in my head. I think maybe as a mom, as a pediatrician, I got stuck on the children who were there not just witnessing, but who were also victims, casualties of this military coup, but who were watching a very momentous event in Afghanistan's history. And so I just wanted to explore it through the eyes of a child who would survive and then carry this with them, and understand that their fate was sort of tied to the fate of the country as well. That as individuals they carry this trauma, as a nation they carry this trauma, and that's why I had to introduce Sitara, because that's where the impact is most felt. It's on the children, right? Because they go on. They're the ones who are building the next generation. They're the ones who are telling the rest of the story.
Yeah, it was also really hard, that part when she meets the president's grandson and like he's alive and how the rest of the family isn't. And the fact that that part was taken from reality really hits you hard.
Yeah, it's sometimes really hard to think what these folks went through, what these people went through, what they experienced in their lives, especially sitting from obviously a place of comfort, of privilege, and just thinking about what it is like to have that set of memories, to have those visions in your head and not be able to erase them, not be able to undo those moments. It's a lot.
Yeah, definitely. Um, and Nadia, one of the questions that I have also is, so what is like, so like I know the story is about Sitara trying to make peace, or I don't know, like, is it about making peace, or is it's mostly about, coming to terms with what happened in her past and then living her life, uh, or like letting go of things, I guess. Like, she lets go of whatever happened to her in the past, and now she's trying to survive and uh, live her life in a way that she wants to. So, but I kept thinking, even after the book ended, like, what did Sitara do after? Did she end up going back to Afghanistan and, like help kids there? Because I know there is this point in the book where she goes to Afghanistan and she saw that there was this lady who was helping a lot of she was a gynec and she was helping a lot of moms in that scenario. And I always kept thinking maybe Sitara is going to do that in the end. Maybe she's going to go back and help women like that. So did you, like, I don't know if you if there is a ending after that.
You know, I like to leave my endings with a little bit of an open feeling, because I think that that's where, you know, I'd like to tell you part of the story, and then for the readers, I like the readers to try to take it from there and be able to imagine the next steps or what happens next on their own, because, you know, we've gone through a journey together for so long by that point, that at that then by then it's not just my story, it's yours. And I think that the rest of that ending could be imagined by anyone in many different ways. And at that point I stop telling you what Sitara has done, and then we start to dream about what she might do next, right? I think that, you know, the possibilities of what Sitara would do have really changed in my mind in light of what's happened now in Afghanistan, right? Because before I would say, sure, maybe she went back and found ways to, you know, treat children over there, or take care of people, or train other doctors. I mean, there's a world of things that she could do, or be involved with a nonprofit. Some of the stuff that I actually see my fellow Afghan Americans doing, and doing in really powerful ways. But in this moment now, it is really hard to say that she would have any capacity to help, especially as people are desperate to flee the country, and as there's, you know, so many questions about people who would even want to be there, and what kind of safety they would have, and what kind of access to healthcare people are going to have. So in this moment in Afghanistan, it's really hard to say that Sitara would be able to do would do the kinds of things that we would want her to do when we reach that final page of the story.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. I think when I read the book, it was way before this happened. So of course, my imagination of what Sitara would do was completely different of what she would do now. It has drastically changed the
And
situation.
that's, I think that's exactly the feeling that so many Afghan Americans are having, and that so many Afghans are having, right? The world of possibilities for what that can happen in the future, what they can do in the future, has completely changed. And the possibility has gone from, like, you know, limitless to, you know, maybe two options. Girls now in Kabul are only going to school until 6th grade. That's the latest, right? So what do you do with a 6th grade education? There's not going to be very much, right? And I think that's really what's really hard, is that strangulation of aspirations, of ambitions, of dreams and hopes.
It's really hard to picture, like, to be clobbered like that in every possible way, that you're not allowed to grow as a person.
Right.
And I know there are a lot of readers like us out there who probably don't know the entire history, or don't know how things started, or so do you have any book recommendations for readers like that?
Yes, and I've put together some lists, and they should be out soon. I'll be circulating that on online as well. I just wrote up a list for electric literature. I also have a list of books that I put out on electric literature as well on their website, for books that are written by Afghan women, and some of them are memoirs, some of them are one is written by a journalist, for example, and there's some biographies in there that really give a take on what's been happening in the country. I think that it's also, you know, books like Ghost Wars or The Wrong Enemy. These are some of the books that take a little bit of a deeper dive into the Afghanistan situation, and those are good reads. Then there are some older texts, like the Dupree couple wrote the book Afghanistan, which is a history of the, you know, sociological and a cultural and political history of the country as well. Probably the best from an Afghan writer is Tamim Ansari, and he has written across genres. So he has written some excellent nonfiction, including Destiny Disrupted and The Great Game, and then he's also written memoir and fiction too.
Thanks, Nadia. We will also make a list of these and put it out.
Sure.
And I guess, Nadia, before we end the conversation, do you have a message for our listeners today?
You know, there are so many books out there. So I'm always very, very grateful when anyone chooses to sit down, make space on their shelves or on their nightstand or on their Kindle for one of these stories, and especially now at this time. So thank you for spending your hours and taking a little bit more of a nuanced look at Afghanistan. My hope is that people will understand that it may look very bleak now, but this story is not over. And we really do need people to keep paying attention to what's happening, because that's, I think, what people in Afghanistan who are looking to turn the lights out on the girls and on the women there, they're really banking on the world having a very short attention span and a narrow bandwidth. But we do need to keep paying attention. It can be exhausting, but hopefully we can keep our eyes on what's going on and keep supporting and pushing in the right directions.
For that message, Nadia. It's a really, really important message, I think, and it's so relevant in today's world. Like, we have so much information available to us now that we end up, sometimes filtering the most important ones out just because there has been a lot of time that has went by, and especially because we are not directly being affected by it. So I think, yeah, that's a really important message. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's so many. I mean, if you look at the news, there are fires in every corner of the world, right? Our attentions are pulled in many, many different directions, and it can be exhausting. So I hope that we can all nurture each other and replenish each other's energies too, so that we don't feel so alone in the work that we're doing.
Yeah, and on that note, I think we can end this conversation because that's just a beautiful message, Nadia. And yes, we all need to just turn towards each other in compassion, I think.
Thank you so much for making this space.
Thank you, Nadia,
Thank
for
you,
taking
Nadia.
time out.